John Wilkinson again, and History Made Easier again. Having looked at the Bolshevik Revolution, this video is going to consider Lenin's consolidation of power. Now then, if gaining power was surprisingly easy for the Bolsheviks, holding on to power would be very difficult. What were the Bolsheviks up against? Well, World War I was still going on. There were the Soviets, and the Bolsheviks were not the only power in the Soviets. And there were the elections for the Constituent Assembly too. Nationalist forces were strong and pushing for at least some degree of independence. The economy remained desperately weak with war going on, and there was the issue of whether socialism would in fact be popular. So the Bolsheviks had a lot to worry about in holding on to power. After all, the provisional government hadn't held on for very long. And so we have the first manifestation of Lenin's dictatorship of the proletariat, the peasantry and the proletariat. And power was going to be centralized by the Bolsheviks. It was centralized in the Council of People's Commissars, known as Sovnarkom. But local control was also essential in a country the size of Russia. Of course, local control was always essential. And Lenin declared a war to the death against the rich, the idlers, and the parasites. And yes, this was his natural ideological direction to take, but it was also a deliberate policy intended to unite the Bolsheviks with workers and peasants. And we have populist policies. Yes, again, they were ideologically founded, but the way in which they were introduced, I would argue, similar to the video that looked at Lenin's rise to power and the Bolshevik Revolution, I would maintain they were pragmatic as well, and they were designed to help hold on to power. They were the product as well of what was happening anyway. And we can begin with what came to be known as looting the looters, which began with spontaneous actions on the streets of Petrograd and Moscow and elsewhere in Russia, and what was happening in the countryside with the manor homes of the gentry. And it was quite simply a attack on their homes and on their persons themselves. We see it in the cities when furniture was dragged out of the homes of the bourgeoisie. Their homes were taken over and subdivided amongst workers. We see it in the looting of the manor houses, taking farming equipment, taking over the land itself, taking the crops that were already in the fields. All of this we can put under the heading of looting of the looters, the personal attacks, and we have people's courts that convicted the bourgeoisie and either led to their deaths or them being thrown into prisons. We have the land decree, really only making legal what was happening anyway, though it did bring in, for example, the church's lands now open to ownership of the people. The decree on the workplace that introduced workers' committees, but again, this was already taking place anyway. And to deal with the growing call for greater independence from Petrograd, for the likes of the Ukraine, we have the Declaration of the Rights of the Peoples of Russia. And this, first of all, ended the privileged rights of Russians, and it called for a voluntary and honourable union. Essentially, it was a gamble. The Bolsheviks had enough on their hands. They knew they couldn't control the growing call for at least greater independence, if not full independence from Russia. They knew they couldn't respond to that, keep the lid on that. So they gambled. They tried to present to the peoples of Russia, and remember, Russians were a minority at the time. They tried to present a benign regime, a regime that would undo the damage that Tsarism had done, and would recognise the cultural differences in Russia, and would hopefully this would hopefully encourage them to affiliate into the Soviet Union. It was a gamble, though, because really they were not in a position to control, to keep the lid on the calls for greater independence, if not total independence. But we do have policies that were not so popular. The first was Lenin's acceptance that there had to be what he called state capitalism, but what we would in the West refer to as a mixed economy, part socialist, but part capitalist too. And Lenin argued, and his argument was with his fellow Bolsheviks on this one, Lenin argued that major estates needed to be kept intact if agriculture was going to be able to feed the peoples of Russia. And he argued that the bigger industrial concerns needed to be nationalised, taken over by the state, but that smaller businesses could remain, at least for the time being, in private hands. It was again Lenin's pragmatism, accepting what was the reality on the ground. But he had to fight the Bolsheviks who felt that, we have risked everything in this second revolution in order to create a socialist state, not part socialist, part still capitalist. But Lenin would have his way. And as regards to the Constituent Assembly, well, we have a high turnout for the Constituent Assembly, and the results of that election really brought up a demand from the people for a coalition of socialist parties, not for a dictatorship of the Bolsheviks. Essentially, it's a bit simplistic, but essentially the Bolsheviks did well in Petrograd and in Moscow and in other cities, but the SRs did well in the countryside. Their vote amongst the peasantry was still very strong. So what did Lenin do? Well, he dismissed it. He dismissed the Constituent Assembly as bourgeois and with Sovnarkom in place as unnecessary. And he also accused it or declared that it was really part of the counter-revolution. And so he forcibly had it closed down. But then we come to another fight that Lenin had to have with his fellow Bolsheviks, and that is ending the war and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Lenin argued that ending the war was absolutely necessary. Look what had happened to the Tsar. Look what had happened to the provisional government. The left, however, had wanted a revolutionary war, uniting peasants and workers with the Bolshevik revolution and inspiring European socialists. So we have this bitter fight that Lenin really had to lay everything on the line before his opponents within the party backed down. So we have not so popular policies, even amongst the Bolsheviks themselves. And then we have terror leading to civil war. We have the murder of the Tsar and his family, partly being pushed by local Bolsheviks, where the Tsar and his family were being held, but the Lenin and the Bolsheviks in Petrograd came to see that the Tsar could be a rallying factor for the counter-revolution, and so there was a need to murder them. And we have the introduction of the Cheka and the war on counter-revolutionaries, the likes of hoarders and speculators, but also a war on other socialists too. The Bolsheviks turned on the socialist revolutionaries and the Mensheviks. And civil war became, it's always a word I am very careful about using in history. Very few things are inevitable in history, but there comes a point when things are. And civil war became virtually inevitable. And for Lenin, it became mostly desirable, because for once and for all, civil war would allow the Bolsheviks to turn on the counter-revolutionaries and deal with them once and for all. So we've covered the Bolshevik Revolution and Lenin's rise to power, and we've covered Lenin's consolidation of power. I hope together they've given you the kind of detail you're looking for. As always, I thank you for listening. Cheers.